The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Suffolk County Courthouse in downtown Boston, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Judge William Barrett adjusted his black robe, preparing for another busy day in courtroom 4A. At 62, with graying hair and stern blue eyes, he had a reputation for running the strictest courtroom in Massachusetts. "All rise," the court officer announced as Judge Barrett entered promptly at 9 a.m. The crowd of lawyers, defendants, and observers rose in unison. The judge's leather chair creaked as he settled behind the imposing oak bench, surveying the room with practiced authority. As he began reviewing the first case, the heavy wooden doors at the back opened with a slight squeak. Judge Barrett looked up, his eyes narrowing at the disruption. A young black woman in a navy blue suit walked in, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she tried to minimize the disturbance. The judge's jaw tightened. Tardiness in his courtroom was unacceptable. "Approach the bench," he commanded, his voice cutting through the hushed room. The woman paused briefly before walking forward with measured steps. She carried a leather briefcase and met his gaze directly. "Your Honor, I apologize for my late arrival. There was an emergency," she explained calmly and articulately. Silence. Judge Barrett interrupted sharply. "What's your name?" "Dr. Kimberly Washington," she replied, maintaining her composure despite his hostility. His eyes swept over her dismissively. "Dr. Washington, this court begins promptly at 9 a.m. Your tardiness is a sign of disrespect to this institution and everyone present." Whispers rippled through the courtroom as Dr. Washington opened her mouth to explain, but Judge Barrett raised his hand to silence her. "I'm holding you in contempt of court," he declared, his tone final. "The fine is $200 to be paid by the end of the day." Dr. Washington's expression remained neutral, though a flicker of something crossed her eyes. She reached for her briefcase, likely to retrieve documentation, but Judge Barrett had already returned to his docket. "Your Honor, if I may," she began again. "You may not," he cut her off. "Pay the fine at the clerk's office. Take a seat or leave my courtroom." The crowd watched as Dr. Washington stood still for a moment, her hands resting on her briefcase. The sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated her face, highlighting her youth and dignity. She finally took a seat in the front row, removed her laptop, and began typing quietly. The judge glanced at her with irritation, but continued with the day's proceedings. Yet, as the next case, a routine traffic violation, was presented, he found himself distracted by her calm demeanor. Something about her acceptance of his punishment unsettled him, though he couldn't pinpoint why. In his 30 years on the bench, Judge Barrett had learned to trust his instincts about people, but Dr. Washington was proving hard to read. The morning sun climbed higher, its rays illuminating the words carved above the bench, "Equal justice under law." Dr. Kimberly Washington, seated in the front row, occasionally glanced at her buzzing phone. Urgent messages from her staff at the State House kept popping up, reminding her of an important vote on an education bill. Yet, here she was, waiting for the right moment to clear up what she viewed as a frustrating misunderstanding. Sarah Chin, the court clerk with 20 years of experience, couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Washington looked familiar. Organizing the day's files at her desk, she kept stealing glances at the young woman, trying to place her face. A vague memory of a recent news segment teased her thoughts, something about a historic election and a newly appointed committee chair. The courtroom doors creaked open again, and a young man in a wrinkled suit rushed in, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Dr. Washington. He hurried to her side, his voice low but urgent. "Representative Washington," he whispered, his words barely audible but catching a few nearby ears. "The vote's been moved up. They need you at the State House right now." Judge Barrett, who had been reviewing another routine case, snapped his head up at the word, "Representative." He frowned, his steel-gray eyebrows drawing together, and fixed his gaze on the whispered conversation. "Quiet in the court," he barked, though his usual air of authority wavered slightly. Dr. Washington rose from her seat, gathering her belongings. She walked toward the bench, her demeanor firm and controlled. This time, she didn't wait for permission to speak. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady yet commanding, I need to address the matter of the contempt charge before I leave. I've already ruled on the matter, Miss Washington, Judge Barrett replied curtly, placing deliberate emphasis on the miss, his irritation evident. That's Representative Dr. Washington, her assistant interjected automatically, only to shrink back when the judge shot him a withering glare. At that moment, Sarah Chin gasped softly, her memory snapping into place. She grabbed a newspaper from her desk and rushed to the bench. Your Honor, I think you should see this, she said, placing the Boston Globe on his desk. Judge Barrett's eyes fell on the front page. There, beneath a bold headline, was a photo of Dr. Kimberly Washington, identified as the youngest Black woman ever elected to the state legislature and the newly appointed chair of the Judiciary Oversight Committee. The color drained from his face as he looked from the newspaper to the woman standing before him. The courtroom had fallen into an uneasy silence. Every eye was trained on the judge and Dr. Washington, the tension palpable. Your Honor, Dr. Washington continued, her tone unwavering despite the weight of the moment. I was late this morning because I was meeting with the governor to discuss the education reform bill being voted on today. I tried to explain earlier, but wasn't given the opportunity. Judge Barrett gripped the edge of his bench, feeling the weight of her words. In all his years on the bench, few moments had made him feel as exposed as this one. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows, once comforting, now felt harsh and unrelenting, as if it were illuminating his flaws for all to see. I respect this court and its protocols, Dr. Washington continued, her voice carrying to the farthest corners of the room, but I also believe in fair hearings and equal treatment. The contempt charge concerns me not because of the fine, but because of what it represents, a rush to judgment without proper consideration. Her assistant checked his watch nervously, whispering, Representative, the vote. Dr. Washington raised a hand, silencing him without looking away from Judge Barrett. Your Honor, I oversee the committee that reviews judicial conduct in this state. I'd like to have a longer conversation about what happened here today, but right now I have a responsibility to my constituents. Judge Barrett sat frozen, the weight of her words pressing heavily on his conscience. The courtroom remained silent, the tension thick. Finally, he managed to speak. The contempt charge is dismissed, he said quietly, his usual commanding tone absent. Representative Washington, we should indeed discuss this matter further. Dr. Washington nodded graciously. I'll have my office contact yours to arrange a meeting. With that, she turned and strode toward the exit, her assistant hurrying beside her. As the doors closed behind her, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Barrett stared at the newspaper still lying on his bench. The headlines seemed to mock him. Rising star in legislature takes on justice reform. Sarah Chin returned to her desk, hiding a small smile. Sometimes, she thought, justice worked in unexpected ways. By lunchtime, news of Judge Barrett's confrontation with Representative Dr. Washington had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. From security guards to senior judges, everyone was buzzing about what had unfolded in Courtroom 4A. The Boston Globe, the centerpiece of the judge's humiliation, now lay untouched on his desk in his chambers. Sitting alone, Judge Barrett stared at the photo of Dr. Washington on the front page. Her poised expression reminded him of the moment she had stood before him, unwavering despite his dismissive attitude. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Come in, he called, his voice unusually subdued. Linda Thompson, his secretary of 15 years, entered carrying a stack of messages. Judge, the media is calling. Channel 5 News, The Globe, and several others are requesting a comment on this morning's incident. He sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as the weight of the morning bore down on him. No comment, he said flatly, the usual authority in his voice absent. There's more, Linda added hesitantly. The Chief Justice wants to see you. Immediately. The walk to Chief Justice Patricia Morgan's office felt longer than it ever had. Whispers filled the courthouse halls as Judge Barrett passed, eyes darting away as staff members pretended not to notice him. But he could feel the judgment in their glances. When he arrived, Chief Justice Morgan wasted no time on pleasantries. Her silver hair and sharp features mirrored her tone, stern and to the point. Sit down, Bill, she said, gesturing to a chair. He obeyed, sensing he was about to receive a scolding he wouldn't soon forget. "Do you realize the mess you've created?" she began, her voice sharp and precise. "Pat, I had no idea who she was," Judge Barrett started, his tone defensive. "And that's exactly the problem," Chief Justice Morgan interrupted. "You should need to know someone's title to treat them with fairness and respect. Dr. Washington isn't just any state representative. She's the chair of the Judiciary Oversight Committee, the very person who reviews judicial appointments and conduct in this state." She pushed a tablet across the desk toward him, the screen displaying a video clip already circulating on social media. Someone in the courtroom had recorded the incident in full. The video, already going viral, captured every dismissive gesture and harsh word Judge Barrett had directed at Dr. Washington. He watched, his throat tightening as the scene replayed before him, each moment more humiliating than the last. "The timing couldn't be worse," Chief Justice Morgan continued. "The Judiciary Budget Review is next month, and her committee holds the purse strings. But more importantly, this incident raises serious questions about bias in our courts. And now the entire state is watching." As if on cue, a muffled commotion from outside reached their ears. Reporters had begun gathering in the courthouse lobby, cameras and microphones in hand, eager for a statement. In another part of the building, Sarah Chin was being interviewed by a local news station. "It was uncomfortable to watch," she admitted, her voice measured but honest. Dr. Washington maintained her dignity throughout, even when she wasn't being heard. "It makes you wonder how many other people are silenced in our courtrooms every day." Back in Chief Justice Morgan's office, Judge Barrett sat quietly as her reprimand continued. "Dr. Washington's office has called," the Chief Justice said. "She's requesting a meeting with you. But instead of filing a formal complaint, she's proposing a conversation about implementing anti-bias training programs across the judiciary." "After the way I treated her?" Judge Barrett asked, disbelief flickering across his face. "Yes," Chief Justice Morgan replied, her tone softening slightly. "And you should be thankful for her grace. She's turning this into an opportunity for institutional improvement, not a personal vendetta. That's real leadership, Bill. You do well to learn from it." A knock on the door interrupted them. Linda stepped in, her expression urgent. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but you both need to see this. Dr. Washington is giving a press conference at the State House." The Chief Justice turned on the television mounted on the wall. Dr. Washington appeared at a podium, poised and professional, speaking to a crowd of reporters. Behind her, the education reform bill she had championed was being celebrated, but the media's focus was on the courthouse incident. "Yes, there was an unfortunate interaction this morning," she acknowledged calmly, "but I don't want to focus on that single event. Instead, I want to address the larger issues it represents. How many of our citizens face similar treatment in courtrooms across our state? How many don't have the privilege of a title to protect them?" Judge Barrett watched in silence, the weight of her words pressing harder on his conscience. "I've already reached out to the court to schedule a meeting," Dr. Washington continued, her voice steady and resolute. "This isn't about one judge or one incident. It's about ensuring our justice system is truly just for everyone." Chief Justice Morgan turned off the television and turned to Barrett. "She's giving you a way forward, Bill. Don't waste this opportunity to make things right." He nodded slowly, finally understanding the full scope of his actions. The words "equal justice under law" carved into the courthouse walls now felt less like a statement and more like a challenge he had failed to meet. The meeting between Judge Barrett and Representative Dr. Washington was scheduled for Friday morning in the courthouse conference room. Judge Barrett arrived early, his nerves getting the better of him. As he waited, his hands fidgeted with his reading glasses, a habit he had developed over years of presiding over tense courtroom moments. On the table in front of him lay the morning newspaper. The headlines were still buzzing about the incident earlier that week, analyzing what it revealed about systemic issues in the judiciary. Mary Rodriguez, the courthouse diversity coordinator, sat beside him with a thick folder of documents. "Remember, Judge Barrett," she said gently, "this is an opportunity for positive change, not a punishment." At exactly 9 a.m., the doors opened and Dr. Washington entered, perfectly on time. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Dressed in a deep purple suit, she carried her signature leather briefcase, her presence commanding attention. Two others accompanied her, James Carter, a civil rights attorney, and Dr. Lisa Chern, an expert in institutional bias training. "Thank you for meeting with us, Your Honor," Dr. Washington began, her voice professional but warm. Judge Barrett cleared his throat, his usual confidence absent. "Representative Washington, I owe you an apology," he said sincerely. "My behavior in the courtroom was unacceptable, and I'm deeply sorry for the way I treated you." Dr. Washington nodded, her expression gracious. "I appreciate the apology, Judge Barrett," she replied, setting her briefcase down and opening her laptop. "But as I said during the press conference, this isn't just about me." She turned her screen to face him. "Let me share something with you." On the screen was a collection of emails Dr. Washington had received in the days following the incident. Each message was from a citizen recounting their experiences in courtrooms across the state, stories of feeling dismissed, judged, or treated unfairly. "These are from people who don't have titles or platforms to protect them," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that was hard to ignore. She began reading excerpts aloud. "A young mother was fined harshly for being 5 minutes late to her hearing because her babysitter didn't show up," she began. "An elderly immigrant was mocked for his accent while trying to explain his case. A Black teenager, there to receive a community service award, was assumed to be a defendant by court staff." Each story hit Judge Barrett like a hammer. He sat in silence, his hands tightening around his reading glasses as he processed the accounts. Dr. Lisa Chern spoke next, her tone clinical but empathetic. "These experiences create a ripple effect. People lose faith in the justice system, and they stop believing they'll be treated fairly. That's why this meeting is so important." James Carter, the civil rights attorney, spread several documents across the table. "We've developed a comprehensive training program for addressing unconscious bias and improving courtroom interactions," he explained. "But we need judges like you, Your Honor, to champion it from within the system." Judge Barrett picked up one of the documents, studying it carefully. "You want me to lead this initiative?" he asked, a mix of surprise and hesitation in his voice. Dr. Washington nodded. "Sometimes the most powerful advocates for change are those who recognize their own need to change," she said. Mary Rodriguez, the diversity coordinator, jumped in. "We could start with a pilot program right here in this courthouse and then expand it statewide," she suggested enthusiastically. As the discussion progressed, Judge Barrett found himself unexpectedly engaged. The training program was thorough, including workshops on unconscious bias, cultural competency, and communication strategies. Every courthouse employee, from judges to clerks to security officers, would participate. "There's one more thing," Dr. Washington said, pulling out another document. "I'd like you to join me in writing an article for the Bar Association Journal about this experience. Complete honesty about what happened, what we've learned, and how we're working to improve." Judge Barrett stared at the document for a long moment. The idea of publicly acknowledging his mistakes went against every instinct he had. Yet, as he looked around the room at the people working tirelessly to improve the system, he realized this was about more than his pride. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice firm. "But I want to add something to the training program: random courtroom audits. Observers should check for bias in real time." Dr. Washington smiled, a genuine smile, the first he had seen from her. "That's an excellent suggestion, Judge Barrett. This is exactly the kind of collaboration we need." By the end of the meeting, the tension that had filled the room earlier had transformed into a sense of shared purpose. As they packed up their materials, Mary Rodriguez couldn't help but feel hopeful. What had started as a confrontation was evolving into a movement for meaningful change. 2 weeks later, the courthouse was buzzing with activity as the new training program officially began. In the main conference room, Judge Barrett stood before a packed audience of judges, clerks, security officers, and other staff. For the first time in his career, his hands felt steady as he addressed the crowd. "Many of you know why we're here today," he began, his voice carrying the authority that had defined his decades on the bench, but now tempered with humility. 2 weeks ago, I made a serious mistake. I let my biases affect how I treated someone in my courtroom. The room was silent, his audience hanging on his every word. This isn't just about me, he continued. This is about all of us. True justice requires more than just following the law. It requires recognizing our biases, challenging our assumptions, and truly listening to every person who enters our courts. Dr. Lisa Chun took over, setting up her presentation. Today's session isn't about shame or blame, she explained. It's about recognition and growth. We all have biases. The key is learning to recognize and manage them. Throughout the training, participants were encouraged to share their own experiences and assumptions. A young bailiff admitted he often watched Black visitors more closely than others. An elderly judge confessed to being less patient with non-English speakers. Each confession created space for more honesty. During a lunch break, Judge Barrett received an email from Dr. Washington. Their co-written article for the Bar Association Journal had just been published. Its title, Justice Begins with Self-Reflection, A Judge's Journey. The afternoon session of the training continued with an interactive exercise led by Dr. Lisa Chun. She displayed photos of different individuals and asked participants to write down their first impressions. The results were eye-opening. Look at how many of us assumed the man in the suit was a lawyer, Dr. Chun pointed out, while the same man in casual clothes was assumed to be a defendant. Judge Barrett sat quietly, observing the reactions of his colleagues as understanding dawned on their faces. He remembered his own moment of realization, the sting of seeing his prejudices laid bare in that viral courtroom video. It hadn't been comfortable, but it had been necessary. Later that afternoon, a surprise visitor arrived. Dr. Washington stepped quietly into the back of the room, nodding encouragingly as Judge Barrett led a discussion on communication strategies. Her presence reminded everyone why they were there. During a break, she pulled Judge Barrett aside. The governor's office called, she said. They want to make this training mandatory for all state courthouses. They've asked us to lead the initiative. Judge Barrett adjusted his reading glasses, a habit when processing significant news. Us? He asked, the word feeling strange on his tongue. Yes, us, Dr. Washington confirmed. Your perspective as someone who's gone through this transformation is valuable. People need to see that change is possible. As the day wrapped up, Mary Rodriguez distributed evaluation forms to the participants. The responses were overwhelmingly positive. One anonymous comment stood out. For the first time, I'm really thinking about how my actions affect others in the courthouse. That evening, Judge Barrett sat alone in his chambers, reviewing the day's materials. A small note lay on his desk, left by Sarah Chun. My cousin had a case in your courtroom today. You listened to her story about being late, really listened. You're already making a difference, Your Honor. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his wallet. 6 months after that pivotal courtroom encounter, the courthouse had undergone a profound transformation. Complaints about unfair treatment had dropped significantly, and trust ratings from court users had risen steadily. The ripple effects of the training program were spreading far beyond Suffolk County. Judge Barrett stood in the courthouse lobby, which had been transformed into a media center for a press conference. Cameras and reporters filled the space, eager for updates on the progress of the initiative. Dr. Washington, as poised as ever, stood by the podium in her signature purple blazer, discussing last-minute details with the governor's staff. At exactly 10 a.m., the press conference began. Governor Phillips stepped forward first. One incident in this courthouse sparked a critical conversation about bias in our justice system, he said. Today, we're turning that conversation into concrete action. Dr. Washington spoke next. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures, she said, her voice clear and firm. Sometimes, it begins with small steps, people willing to acknowledge mistakes and work to correct them. When it was Judge Barrett's turn to speak, he left his prepared notes folded in his pocket. 6 months ago, I thought I was one of the good ones, he began honestly. I believed that following the law automatically made me fair. I was wrong. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. True justice requires more than knowing the law. It requires us to recognize our biases, challenge our assumptions, and, above all, listen, really listen, to the people who come into our courts. He described the changes they had implemented: regular training sessions, anonymous feedback systems, courtroom observers, and monthly staff meetings to discuss challenging situations. The most significant shift, however, had been in their mindset. "We've learned to see every case, every person, as more than just a number," he said. During the Q&A session, a young reporter raised her hand. "Judge Barrett, do you regret how you treated Representative Washington that day?" The room grew silent as all eyes turned to him. Dr. Washington watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "I regret my actions that day," he said slowly, "but I'm grateful for what they taught me. Representative Washington could have demanded my resignation. Instead, she showed me a better path forward." As the press conference ended, Mary Rodriguez approached Judge Barrett, her excitement evident. "Judge, you won't believe this," she said, holding up her phone. "3 more states have contacted us about implementing the program. They want to send observers to see how it works." 6 months later, Judge Barrett stood before a packed auditorium at the National Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C. Behind him, a large screen displayed statistics from their courthouse's transformation: complaints down by 60%, public trust ratings up by 45%, and over 20 states adopting similar programs. "I'd like to begin with a story," he said, addressing the room. "Last week, Maria Gonzalez came to my courtroom 15 minutes late for her hearing. 6 months ago, I would have fined her on the spot. Instead, I asked why she was late. She explained that her babysitter had canceled, and she'd had to walk 3 miles to the courthouse with her young son." He paused, letting the audience absorb the story. "We didn't just waive her penalties. Our new court support system connected her with affordable childcare resources. That's what justice really looks like: understanding people's circumstances before making judgments." Dr. Washington, seated in the front row, nodded in approval. She had flown in specifically for a speech, despite her busy legislative schedule. During the Q&A session, a skeptical judge from Texas asked, "Doesn't this slow everything down? We already have packed dockets." Dr. Washington stepped up to the microphone. "Actually, we've found the opposite to be true," she explained. "When people feel heard and respected, cases move more smoothly. We've seen fewer appeals, fewer complaints, and better compliance with court orders." By the end of the session, dozens of judges approached Judge Barrett and Dr. Washington, eager to learn more about the program. Back at the courthouse, the changes continued to ripple outward. Mary Rodriguez now led regular training sessions for new employees, emphasizing the importance of cultural competency and unbiased communication. In his chambers, Judge Barrett received a call from the President's Council on Justice Reform. "They're considering making our program a federal requirement," Dr. Washington informed him. "That one difficult morning in court," he replied, "has led to all this." Later that day, Judge Barrett presided over a naturalization ceremony, his favorite duty. As he watched new citizens take their oaths, he reflected on how different the courthouse felt now. The once intimidating building had become a place where every person, regardless of their background, felt seen and heard. As he walked through the courthouse halls, he passed a plaque near the entrance. It read, "Change begins with one moment of recognition, grows through countless acts of understanding, and lives on in every life it touches." Judge Barrett paused, letting the words sink in. For the first time in his career, he felt like he truly understood the responsibility behind them. A month after Judge Barrett's speech at the National Judicial Conference, Suffolk County Courthouse had become a model of transformation. Delegations from across the country and even internationally visited to observe their progress. Each visitor left inspired by the changes that began with a single, uncomfortable confrontation. On a crisp morning, Judge Barrett sat in his chambers reviewing a thick folder of letters from court users. Each letter told a story of how the courthouse had shifted its approach to justice. One stood out. "Dear Judge Barrett," it began, "I was late to court because I couldn't find childcare. Instead of punishing me, your staff connected me with resources to help me. For the first time, I felt seen in a courtroom. Thank you for understanding." He carefully folded the letter and placed it in his growing collection. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. Linda stepped in with her usual efficiency. "Your 9:30 visitor is here, Judge." "Send them in," he said, adjusting his glasses. The visitor was a young judge from California, sent to learn how Suffolk County had managed to balance fairness and efficiency. "I have to admit," the visiting judge began, "when I first heard about your program, I thought it would be impossible to implement without slowing everything down. But your results speak for themselves." Judge Barrett nodded thoughtfully, remembering his own initial skepticism. "Let me show you something," he said, pulling out a binder filled with observation reports, feedback forms, and stories like the one he had just read. "These aren't just numbers," he explained. "These are lives, people who deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances." Down in the lobby, Mary Rodriguez led a group of new courthouse employees on an orientation tour. She pointed to the redesigned welcome desk, where staff now spoke 6 different languages. "This desk ensures that no one feels lost or ignored in our courthouse anymore," she said. Meanwhile, Court Officer James Martinez demonstrated the new approach to security. "We don't just watch people," he explained to his team. "We welcome them. Security is about more than protection. It's about making people feel safe and respected." Judge Barrett finished his meeting with the visiting judge by handing over a copy of the training manual they had developed. "Change isn't easy," he said, "but it's necessary. If you commit to it, the results will surprise you." Back in her office at the State House, Dr. Washington was reviewing data with her staff. The success of the program had exceeded even her expectations. Complaints about courtroom bias were down by 60%, and the training had sparked conversations in sectors beyond the judiciary. A knock on her door pulled her from her work. It was her chief of staff. "Representative, the President's Council on Justice Reform has invited you and Judge Barrett to speak at their summit. They're considering making your program a federal requirement." Dr. Washington leaned back in her chair, a quiet sense of satisfaction washing over her. She immediately picked up the phone to call Judge Barrett. Later that week, Judge Barrett and Dr. Washington met in the courthouse conference room to prepare for the summit. Over the months, their professional relationship had blossomed into an easy friendship. "Can you believe this all started with me holding you in contempt of court?" Judge Barrett remarked with a wry smile. Dr. Washington laughed lightly. "I think about it often," she replied. "What if I hadn't been an elected official that day? What if I didn't have a platform to push back?" Judge Barrett's expression turned serious. "I think about that too," he admitted. "It reminds me of all the people who faced the same treatment but couldn't speak up. That's why this work is so important." Their discussion turned to the summit presentation. Dr. Washington wanted to emphasize the program's scalability, while Judge Barrett planned to focus on the personal transformations it had inspired. "We need to show them that this isn't just about fixing the judiciary," Dr. Washington said. "It's about changing the way we think about justice itself." Judge Barrett nodded in agreement. "And it all starts with listening." 6 months to the day after the infamous courtroom incident, Suffolk County Courthouse had become almost unrecognizable in its culture and practices. The changes were evident not just in policy, but in atmosphere. On a typical morning, the courthouse was bustling with activity, but the usual tension had been replaced by a sense of collaboration and respect. At the redesigned entrance, a new sign greeted visitors in multiple languages. "Welcome to your courthouse. Every story matters here." In the lobby, Sarah Chun, now the head court clerk, conducted a meeting with her team. "We're seeing fewer appeals and complaints," she said, her tone proud. "People are feeling heard, and that's making all the difference." Court Officer Martinez led a security briefing, emphasizing their new approach. "Remember, we're not just here to enforce rules," he told his team. "We're here to create an environment where people feel respected and safe." In his chambers, Judge Barrett was preparing for his morning docket when Linda stepped in with a message. "You'll want to hear this," she said, her smile barely contained. The message was from the governor's office. The state legislature had voted unanimously to expand the training program statewide. Even more exciting, the federal government was considering adopting it as a national model. Later that day, Judge Barrett presided over a naturalization ceremony, one of his favorite duties. As he watched new citizens take their oaths, he couldn't help but reflect on how far the courthouse had come. He spotted Dr. Washington standing quietly at the back of the room, there to observe the ceremony. Afterward, they walked together through the courthouse halls, their conversation light but reflective. "I think we've done something remarkable here," Dr. Washington said. Judge Barrett glanced at the sign above the courthouse entrance, "Equal justice under law." For the first time, he felt they were truly living up to those words. The announcement of the statewide expansion of the bias training program came with a new challenge, a joint interview on live television. Dr. Washington and Judge Barrett had been invited to discuss the program on a popular news show watched by millions across the state. In the studio's green room, Judge Barrett sat uncharacteristically quiet, fiddling with his glasses. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he asked, glancing at Dr. Washington, who was calmly reviewing her notes. "Plenty of times," she replied with a smile. "But it doesn't get easier. The key is to focus on the message, not the noise." Moments later, they were ushered onto the brightly lit set. The host, a sharp-eyed journalist known for her probing questions, wasted no time diving into the heart of the matter. "Judge Barrett," she began, "many people were surprised that you, someone with a reputation for being rigid, are now leading this initiative. What changed?"